I know what really killed the old western town of Calico. It came from the mines. My name is Elizabeth Langley. I'm 84 years of age, and I have lived in England for my entire life. My father, on the other hand, always had a faint American accent, so I used to ask him about his life before he moved to this country. I grew up in Oakley, California, my father answered. What a place. I miss it, Elizabeth. I really do. Still, I wouldn't have met your mother if we hadn't settled in England. Why did your family move here? Was it the war? I asked. No, I was a young boy when my father packed our bags. No more than 13 years of age. As you know, your grandfather is a complicated man. He never told me why we were moving. He simply said he just didn't feel he could do it anymore. I didn't, and I still don't, know what he meant, my father explained. My curiosity had been piqued. I had expected a simple answer, but that response only left me with more questions. I knew I had to talk to my grandfather. I had to know what happened in America. I would have preferred to live my life without this tale rattling around at the back of my mind. It is not a story for children, my grandfather told me. Every Christmas he would come to stay with us, and every Christmas I pleaded for him to tell his tale. Well, in the year of 1948, my grandfather finally caved, revealing what happened during the dying days of the Wild West. He realized that I would never stop pestering him, after all. And I listened with eager ears, as I had always fantasized about America. I longed for the sun-drenched plains of California, rather than the bleak remnants of a post-war London. That dream died when my grandfather told me about Calico. Recently, I summoned the courage to tell Grandpa's tale to my grandson, who insisted that I share it online. A frightening fairy tale, he called it. The young boy clearly doesn't believe me, but he never knew my grandfather. That man was many things. However, he did not lie. My grandparents met in San Francisco, and they moved to Oakley when my father was born. There was nothing wrong with Oakley, the dear old man explained to me. There had been nothing wrong with San Francisco either. My grandfather left America because something awful happened long before he met my grandmother. Long before he came to San Francisco. Grandpa had tried, for years, to flee his past. Nowhere was far enough. Even as he told this tale to me, the man admitted that travelling to England had never offered the respite he so desperately sought. He said that it was time he told somebody his story. He prayed it would lessen the burden. Before moving to San Francisco in 1896, my grandfather had been a prospector. He left home at the age of 16, hiked from town to town, and eventually attempted to set roots in Calico, California. Most Americans have probably heard of this western ghost town, but for those who don't know about it, the official story about this boom and bust place is that minerals dwindled, as they did in many western towns. And when the mines dried up, people moved away. However, my grandfather, Harley, insisted that something else happened in Calico. There was another reason the townsfolk disappeared. It began in 1895. My grandfather had been living in Calico for 3 years. He had become a part of the community, and he saw himself as more than a prospector. He even considered settling there for good. There were a few handsome women in town that he said he would have considered marrying. And the man had plenty of friends, drinking partners in the saloon. Harley had everything he needed. Silver was starting to lose its value, but my grandfather didn't care. He was only 21 years old, but he was tired. There had to be more to life than mining for valuable resources, and he believed that Calico could become more than a hub for the silver rush. Perhaps it would have, if not for the horror that followed. Harley swore that the death of mining was not the death of Calico. In December of 1895, townsfolk started to go missing. Search efforts were half-hearted, as the icy nights deterred most people from exerting their full efforts. They wanted to stay indoors. Harley said that a prospector named Lester Grant talked of something he had found in the mines. A new mineral. Something that would save the mine and, in turn, the town of Calico. The prospector claimed it to be something he'd never seen before. Something, perhaps, more valuable than silver. My grandfather and his friend, James, dismissed the prattling miner. They knew, as did everybody in the saloon, that Lester was a drunkard. They were all drunkards, of course, but it was a hobby for most of the townsfolk. For Lester, it was a vocation. Mr. Grant, as you might have guessed, was the first person to vanish without a trace. Others soon followed, all manner of townsfolk. Miners, barbers, bartenders, and even one of the sheriff's deputies. 13 people disappeared in a matter of days, and the search parties became frantic. One evening, while Sheriff Harper drank with Harley and his friends in the saloon, the police officer urged the men to not let word spread about the disappearances. He didn't want any outside law enforcement to get involved. Harper detested city folk, and the sheriff referred to the horror as simply life on the frontier. There were so many possible explanations for the disappearances. Coyotes, bandits, people catching the dying scent of the silver rush and fleeing, perhaps. My grandfather wanted to favour that third suggestion. Everybody favoured it. It was better to assume that townsfolk had simply moved away, rather than assuming some harm had come to them. Still, Harley was a wise man, and he didn't believe that anybody had left Calico. My grandfather kept thinking about Lester's warning. So, he continued to raise the issue in the saloon, night after night, and James implored his friend to stop. He needed the mine. He needed the town. Like most people, Harley's pal was too fixated on the final gasp of the frontier to notice anything else. Another week later, when the number of disappearances totaled 19 people, my grandfather's nightly saloon talk was interrupted. Martha, the bartender, then joined Harley and his friends at their table. The men offered their condolences. A few days prior, Martha's sister had gone missing. My grandfather said that the bartender's haunted disposition filled him with great unease. She looked not like somebody in the throes of grief, but somebody with a terrible secret. Martha did not stall, did not mince her words. She said that her sister had returned. One of the men at the table excitedly roared that they must notify the sheriff, but Martha sobbed, explaining that the man did not understand. The previous night, the bartender stood at her upstairs window and gazed at the sandy main road which ran through Calico. There, gazing back, was something in her sister's yellow sundress. My grandfather remembered exactly how Martha described the figure. I too struggled to erase his exact wording from my mind. She painted a nightmarish picture to Harley, one that, decades later, was permanently penciled into my brain. "I scarcely saw her in the moonlight," Martha said. "My joy didn't last, as I soon realised that Lucy had no discernible facial features. Just a mouth. A gaping mouth, black as the night. She was emaciated, yet so much taller than I remember. So large that her dress had torn at the seams. I saw so little of her, but I heard her. Did any of you hear that sound last night? A whistling scream? It sounded like an animal calling to the pack. Of course, most of the men in the saloon gently refuted Martha's story, claiming that grief had driven her to lunacy. They hadn't heard a scream. A wild coyote or wolf, perhaps, but nothing else. However, my grandfather said that James looked at him with a pale expression. He whispered to Harley that he had heard a blood-curdling scream during the night. James thought he had been dreaming because it was not a sound that he had ever heard an earthly animal produce. Harley told his friend to stay calm. He knew who could help. The next morning, my grandfather and James did not join their friends in the mines. They travelled southeast, searching for a small tribe of Native Americans that lived near the town of Yermo. Harley knew a woman named Aunt Jenny, one of the elders. Over the years, he had sold various minerals to her from his prospecting ventures in local towns. Harley explained to James that Aunt Jenny had once told him of a haunting creature known as a Wendigo. Whilst Martha's sister did not match that description, the encounter certainly sounded like something beyond the realm of logical explanation. The elder had once told my grandfather that there were things the colonizers had not experienced. If there were anyone capable of identifying what Martha saw, it would be the tribe leader. When the two men arrived at the tribal village, Aunt Jenny was already expecting Harley's arrival. She told him they had received word of something that had been unearthed in Calico. An old thing that should have been left alone. In the past, the old woman had cautioned my grandfather against prospecting in Calico. She said that land was fragile. Dark things lay there, and those dark things should not have been disturbed. According to my grandfather, James looked even whiter than the night before. Harley kept encouraging his friend to drink water, because he didn't want the man to faint on the ride back to Calico. Besides, my grandfather wasn't finished. He needed to know more. He begged Aunt Jenny to tell him what was happening to the people of Calico. The elder was far more terrified about this creature than any of the others she had discussed. She said one word: Deba. A creature of many names, given that it lives in many places. There is a force deep in the earth that calls out to desperate people, calls to those who need something, much like the residents of Calico who faced the extinction of their livelihoods. Harley inferred that Lester must have felt this force calling to him. There had never been a magical mineral in the mine that would solve all of their problems. Something else had enticed him. Everybody in Calico wanted more. The force must have been beckoning all of them to enter the mines. How long, my grandfather wondered, would it be before everyone was gone? And Jenny explained that the thirst cannot be quenched until the victim has become a Deba. Then their mortal desires fade away, and the reborn person thirsts only for souls. The creature drains the flesh and spirit of all those who cross its path. The elder said, it is a fate worse than death. When the soul has been consumed, the victim is denied passage to the afterlife. My grandfather heeded her warning and dragged James to the horses, preparing to return to Calico with the awful news. Before leaving, however, Aunt Jenny snatched my grandfather's wrist and whispered into his ear. She told him that James had the thirst. she could see it. She begged Harley not to follow his friend into the mines. My grandfather did not reply. He told me that he vividly remembered his friend smiling at him with weak, pleading eyes. Then Harley kicked his stirrups, and the pair rode back to Calico. My grandfather did not want to believe it. He wanted to save his friend, but he knew that James was already gone. The man had heard the call of whatever sinister being lay deep in the ground, and his thirst would not be quenched until that call had been answered. As the pair crossed the arid landscape, the sun began to sink beyond the horizon. Calico emerged when the light had all but vanished. Uncharacteristically, for that time of night, there was not a single lit lamp in the town. It had been engulfed by night. There was no light, no movement, and no sound. The two men unsaddled themselves and hitched their horses to a post. James was shivering, and my grandfather wasn't sure how to aid his friend. Harley dipped his head over the saloon doors, peering into the empty building. Not a person in sight. My grandfather told James that they needed to see the sheriff. Keeping the unwell man in his line of sight, Harley led James across the isolated town. When they reached the sheriff's office, they were met with an open doorway. It revealed only blackness within the building, but there was a kerosene lamp perched on a table in the centre of the room. With great trepidation, my grandfather took a few cautious steps into the dark office and called for the sheriff.
Hello?
There was no response. Harley tiptoed towards the table, picked up the kerosene lamp, and spun in a circle to get his bearings. What my grandfather saw next is something that still chills me to the bone. I have no idea how horrified he must have felt. It was the sheriff. The law officer was not one of the Diba. He was not anything. The corpse lay on the hard floor, barely visible in the dim glow of my grandfather's lamp. Sheriff Harper was a shell. That's how his corpse was described to me. He had been, much as Jenny promised, drained both in flesh and spirit, reduced to little more than bones, draped with bloody strips of flesh. My grandfather said the skull was the worst part of the scene. The sheriff's skin was mostly intact, though grey and colourless, but his eye sockets were empty, and his skull was split roughly down the middle. Harley vomited. I'm not quite sure how he managed to hold his stomach as long as he did. I did not want to press him on the matter. I was happy to move forwards with the story, though things only worsened. When my grandfather left the sheriff's office, James had vanished, much like the rest of the town. Harley called for his friend, but Calico was silent. Nobody responded. Not wanting to leave his loved ones behind, but understanding that the battle had already been lost, my dear old grandfather accepted defeat and began walking back to his horse. He was finally prepared to leave Calico behind. Harley untied his ticket out of that hellish place, mounted the saddle, and then looked back at the town. I still remember my grandfather's face when he reached this part of the story. The firmness of his expression. The same paralysis that must have gripped him decades earlier. Grandpa asked me whether we should abandon the tale there, but he continued before I answered. There was a whistling scream. And then my grandfather saw her. Martha. She burst through the saloon doors and sprinted onto the main road before tripping and falling. The bartender had been hiding in the building, but something found her. My grandfather certainly didn't see the woman when he peered his head inside earlier, but he definitely saw her as she scrambled across the road on her hands and knees, just as he saw the creature that followed her from the saloon, ducking as it crept through the doorway. The Diba. Larger and ghastlier than the sister that Martha had described. From its nondescript shirt and ragged trousers, Harley struggled to identify which missing town member was stalking the bartender. He said he hardly had time to assess the scene. It was over before it really began. The once human creature used spider-like limbs to move at great speed. Moonlight sufficiently illuminated the scene of terror that unfolded before my grandfather. The Diba lunged towards Martha with one of the gnarly appendages that used to be its left hand, and it seized her by the throat. The bartender screeched at the top of her lungs, scratching the Diba's left hand with both of hers and desperately swinging both of her legs back and forth. It was a fruitless endeavour, and Harley knew he should avert his gaze. He knew he should ride away, never looking back, but he felt unable to peel his eyes from the scene before him. Raising her off the ground, the Diba moved its right hand towards Martha's face. Suddenly, my grandfather understood what he had seen in the sheriff's office, and he understood what he was about to see. The creature morphed its right hand into a claw and violently forced its thumb into Martha's right eye socket. My grandfather sobbed profusely as he told me this part of the tale. He said he had never felt so utterly helpless. He watched one of his dearest friends suffer so slowly and agonizingly. Martha's screams grew in volume and ferocity. The creature suspended her in the air with the thumb that had pierced her right eye, and then it released her neck with its left hand. Without pause, the Diba proceeded to plunge its left thumb into her remaining eye socket. My grandfather assured me that Martha's screaming rivaled that of the Diba. It was almost as horrific. Almost. Lifting her body higher into the air, as if she were a trophy, the creature started to pull its hands outwards. Its thumbs were firmly lodged into the bloody sockets that had once housed Martha's eyes. Her shrieking reached an unbearable volume. With an almighty tearing noise, the awful sound of Martha's agony ceased. The Diba stared longingly at the split corpse it held in its hands, and then it began to drink from the canyon it had formed between the two halves of Martha's skull. My grandfather said he uttered a sound, an involuntary one. He had been resisting the urge to cry or scream, but at that moment, a gasp escaped. The creature stopped eating. It turned to face Harley, and that was when the true cacophony started. A chorus of whistling screams. They echoed across the town. Creatures began to reveal themselves from the nooks and crannies of Calico. One of them wore a yellow sundress. My grandfather distinctly remembered that. I'm not sure how he made it to his horse. Perhaps the Diba had been busy feeding when my grandfather first strolled through the town. Whatever the case, he had been fortunate to avoid them, but his luck finally ran out. Harley's horse had been whinnying uncontrollably since he mounted it, possibly only standing still for so long because it was frozen in the same state of dread as my grandfather. At this point, Harley said his stallion seemed only too happy to oblige when he yanked its reins and steered towards the road that led out of town. There was one last demon for my grandfather to face before he could leave Calico behind for good. One last creature stood in the middle of the road to freedom. James. My grandfather said he was not surprised to see the gaping black hole of a mouth and those monstrous limbs. But that didn't make it any less painful to witness. Goodbye, old friend. Those were Harley's final words to James as he ploughed onwards, head buried in his horse's mane of hair. He charged towards his old friend and prepared for the cold embrace of death. It didn't come. When my grandfather opened his eyes, he was free. His horse had galloped far beyond the border of Calico. Harley looked over his shoulder to see his old friend standing at the side of the road. James had stepped aside to let my grandfather pass. He may not have been quite as far gone as the others. He may have retained enough of his humanity to resist the thirst, just a little longer. Just long enough to ensure my grandfather would survive to tell the horrible tale. Before moving to San Francisco in 1896, Grandpa travelled back to Yermo to see Aunt Jenny, though he steered clear of Calico. The elder told him that some of the townsfolk had survived that unspeakable night by fleeing to the hills. She told my grandfather that the Debo were not seen again, as they require constant sustenance to survive. Once the remaining townsfolk fled, the unnatural beings had no way to quench their thirst. They must have perished. That was the prevailing hypothesis. Other than the few Calico survivors and the people of Aunt Jenny's tribe, nobody ever learned of what happened in that town. In fact, Calico lasted for another decade. My grandfather explained that many returned and tried to squeeze the last few drops of life out of the town before it was officially abandoned in 1907. Sometimes I wonder whether the creatures may have returned. They may have lured fools back to Calico because they were still thirsting for something. The mines may have called to them.